The last thing my mother asked of me was not forgiveness, or comfort, or even love. It was a promise. Quiet, urgent, pressed into my hand like something fragile she could no longer carry herself. The hospital room was too bright for a goodbye. Machines hummed softly, indifferent to the way my world was folding in on itself. My mother lay small against the white sheets, her breathing uneven, each inhale sounding like it had to fight to exist. I stood beside her, numb in the way only grief can make you present, but barely. My father had stepped out to speak with the doctor. That was when my mother's eyes opened wider than they had all day. She turned her head slightly, just enough to look at me directly, and in that look there was fear. Not of dying, of something else. "Listen to me," she whispered. Her voice was thin but steady. "You have to promise me something." I leaned closer, my forehead almost touching hers. "Anything," I said. The word came easily, too easily. She swallowed, her fingers tightening around mine with surprising strength. "You can't tell your father, ever." The room seemed to shrink around us. I remember the sound of the monitor suddenly feeling louder, more intrusive, as if it were listening. I remember thinking she was delirious, that this was the confusion people talk about at the end. I waited for her to explain, to soften it with context. She didn't. "What?" I asked quietly. "Tell him what?" Her grip tightened again, nails pressing into my skin. "You don't need to know everything right now," she said. "Just promise me you won't tell him, it would destroy him, and it won't help anyone." Love surged through me then, hot and panicked. This was my mother. She had been my constant, gentle where my father was firm, silent where he was loud. If she was asking for this now, at the edge of her life, it had to matter. It had to be important. "I promise," I said. The word landed between us, heavy and irrevocable. The moment it left my mouth, something in her face eased. Her shoulders relaxed. For the first time in days, she looked almost peaceful. That should have comforted me. Instead, it terrified me. My father returned moments later, unaware of the exchange that had just rewritten my life. He kissed my mother's forehead, told her he loved her, held her hand. I stood there with them, carrying a secret I didn't yet understand, already feeling its weight settle into my chest. She died that night. In the days that followed, people told me how lucky I was to have been there at the end. How special it was that she had trusted me with her final moments. I nodded, accepted condolences, said all the right things. I didn't tell anyone about the promise. I didn't even tell myself what it meant. At first, it felt simple. She had asked for silence. I would give it to her. Love had always meant protection in our family, and this was just another way to protect her, even after she was gone. But grief has a way of loosening things you thought were tied tight. As the shock wore off, the promise grew louder. It echoed in quiet moments, in the pauses between conversations, in the way my father looked at me with open trust and shared sorrow. He leaned on me heavily, telling me how lost he felt, how he didn't know how to move forward without her. Every time he spoke, I felt the secret shift inside me, restless. I began to sense that what my mother had asked wasn't finished business. Secrets don't like being buried. They press upward, demanding air. And this one felt especially alive, as if it carried her unfinished breath inside it. I replayed that moment by her bed again and again. Her fear, her urgency, the way she said it would destroy him. What could possibly be so devastating that it had to be carried beyond death? The promise had been made in love. I was sure of that. But love, I was starting to understand, doesn't always come clean. Sometimes it asks you to choose comfort over truth. Sometimes it mistakes peace for silence. At night, I dreamed of my mother standing in doorways, trying to speak, her mouth opening without sound. I woke up with my heart racing, the sense that something was unfinished, unresolved. As if she had handed me not a secret to keep, but a burden to understand. I told myself I was honoring her. That keeping quiet was an act of loyalty. But beneath that reassurance lived a growing unease. A feeling that the promise was not meant to last forever. That my mother hadn't been asking me to bury the truth, but to hold it until the right moment. And that moment, I feared, was coming. Standing in that hospital room, I had believed I was offering her peace. I didn't realize I was also accepting unrest. Love had made the promise easy. Truth would make it unbearable. That was the beginning, not just of my grief, but of a question I could no longer ignore. Why would my mother choose silence over honesty at the very end? And why, even now, did it feel like she couldn't rest? The day after the funeral, the house felt wrong. Not empty wrong. Every object sat exactly where it belonged, but nothing felt settled. Grief had rearranged the air, thickened it, made even familiar rooms feel unfamiliar. I moved through the house quietly, as if sound itself might disturb something fragile that had been left behind. My father woke early and made coffee, the way he always had. The smell drifted down the hallway, warm and ordinary, and for a moment I forgot she was gone. Then I heard him clear his throat in that careful way people do when they are holding themselves together, and the memory snapped back into place. We sat at the kitchen table without speaking. He stared into his mug, hands wrapped around it like it was the only solid thing left. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red but steady. "I don't know how to do this without her," he said. The words landed gently, but they carried weight. He wasn't asking for advice. He was leaning. And instinctively, I leaned back, offering presence, nodding, listening. This was the role I knew how to play. The shared grief was visible, almost comforting in its familiarity. But beneath it, something else was growing. Every time he spoke about my mother, I felt the promise shift inside me. It pressed against my ribs, reminding me that my grief was no longer uncomplicated. I was mourning her while also guarding something she had left behind. Silence sat between us at the table, shaped differently for each of us. Friends and relatives came by in waves. They brought food, flowers, stories. They told me how strong I was, how much my mother loved me, how lucky my father was to have me. I smiled and thanked them, performing the version of myself they expected. Inside, I felt divided. When people asked how my father was holding up, I said he was managing. When they asked how I was doing, I said I was taking it one day at a time. All of it was true. None of it was complete. At night, the house creaked in ways it never had before. Or maybe I was just listening differently. I lay awake replaying conversations, searching for meaning in things my mother had said years ago, wondering if the secret had always been there, quietly shaping our lives. My father started talking to me more than he ever had. He told me stories about when they first met, about arguments they never resolved, about how much he regretted the little things. He spoke freely, unaware that every word was tightening the knot I carried. I wanted to protect him. That part of me hadn't changed. But protection now required deception, and deception came at a cost I was only beginning to understand. I noticed how my perception of my parents was shifting. My mother, once simply gentle and loving, now felt layered, complicated by the knowledge that she had withheld something significant. My father, once solid and dependable, now seemed fragile in a way I hadn't fully seen before. Silence changed the way I listened. I began to hear questions in my father's voice that he didn't know how to ask. I began to feel answers pressing at the back of my throat, desperate to escape. The promise became heavier each day. What had felt like an act of love at her bedside now felt like an act of concealment. I told myself it was temporary, that time would clarify things, that grief was distorting my thoughts. But grief didn't invent the tension. It revealed it. One afternoon, my father stood in the doorway of her bedroom, unable to enter. "She always knew things," he said softly. "Things I didn't. Do you think she ever kept anything from me?" The question was casual. The impact was not. I felt my heartbeat in my ears. I chose my words carefully, aware that even hesitation could betray me. "I don't know," I said. It was the safest answer I could manage. He nodded, accepting it, and walked away. The relief I felt was immediate and deeply unsettling. That night, I realized the secret had already begun to change me. I was no longer simply grieving alongside my father. I was standing apart from him, guarding a truth he didn't know existed. The comfort of shared mourning had fractured into isolation. Silence had become active. It required maintenance, attention, choices. I began to understand why my mother's request felt unfinished. She hadn't passed the burden to me to be hidden away forever. She had passed it because she could no longer carry it herself. As the days moved forward, outward life resumed. People returned to work. Messages slowed. The world regained its rhythm, but inside me the promise grew louder, heavier, more insistent. I was learning that concealment is not neutral. It shapes relationships even when nothing is said. And as I watched my father grieve openly, trusting me completely, I understood with painful clarity. Keeping this secret was already changing everything. Before my mother died, I would have told you I knew my father completely. Not perfectly, but enough. He was predictable in the way solid things are predictable. He woke early, worked hard, spoke plainly. He believed in rules, in responsibility, in doing what needed to be done whether it felt good or not. Growing up, that steadiness felt like safety. He was not unkind. That matters. He showed love through provision, through fixing what broke, through staying when others might have left. When I was sick as a child, he sat beside my bed with quiet patience. When I failed at something, he didn't coddle me, but he didn't abandon me either. He expected resilience because he believed we were capable of it. That was the version of him I carried into adulthood. The father who loved deeply but expressed it carefully. The man who valued honesty, even when it hurt. The man my mother had chosen. Which was why her final request unsettled me so deeply. Why would she be afraid to tell him something now, at the end, when there was nothing left to lose? As I moved through the days after the funeral, memories of my father surfaced with new sharpness. I saw moments I had once filed away as normal, ordinary, unquestionable. Now they felt altered, as if the light had changed and revealed shadows I hadn't noticed before. He liked things done his way. That had always been clear. Decisions were discussed but rarely debated. He believed compromise was acceptable only after structure was established. My mother used to say, gently, "That's just how he is," whenever tension arose. It sounded affectionate then, reassuring. I remembered arguments that ended abruptly, not because they were resolved, but because my mother fell silent. I remembered the way she'd smooth things over later, adjusting her tone, her plans, her expectations. I had assumed that was partnership. Now I wondered if it was accommodation. My father never raised his voice often. When he did, it wasn't explosive. It was controlled, measured, and somehow more unsettling for it. He didn't threaten. He stated facts. He didn't shout. He concluded. And once he concluded, discussion ended. At the time, I admired that certainty. It felt like strength. But strength can cast long shadows. I thought about the way my mother would sometimes glance at him before answering a question, as if checking her response against an invisible standard. I thought about the topics she avoided when he was in the room, the stories she told only when he wasn't home. I had seen these things before. I just hadn't interpreted them as warning signs. Grief has a way of rearranging memory. It loosens assumptions, forces re-examination. As I watched my father move through his days now, rigid with loss, clinging to routine, I began to see how much control had always mattered to him, how deeply he relied on order to feel secure, and how threatening disorder might have been. I wondered whether my mother's secret challenged that order, whether it disrupted the version of life he believed in, whether it revealed something he could not reconcile with his sense of himself. The possibility unsettled me. My father spoke often about the past now, revisiting decisions, defending choices, explaining events no one had questioned. He talked about sacrifices he had made, about how hard things had been, about how much he had carried for our family. There was truth in his words. And there was something else, too, a need to be seen as right. I listened carefully, aware that my silence now served a different purpose than before. I was no longer just absorbing grief. I was guarding information. That shift changed the way I heard him. I began to notice how easily his certainty hardened into dismissal, how quickly discomfort turned into impatience, how rarely he sat with ambiguity. My mother, by contrast, had lived comfortably in uncertainty. She felt her way through things. She allowed questions to remain unanswered. Maybe that was why the secret had belonged to her for so long. One evening, my father mentioned a period in their marriage I barely remembered. A difficult year, he said, when things had been strained. He spoke of it vaguely, as if precision might open doors he preferred to keep closed. She worried too much, he said, always afraid of consequences that never came. The words struck me like a quiet accusation, not against her, but against my own emerging doubts. I realized how often he framed fear as weakness, caution as overreaction. If my mother had been afraid to tell him something, would he have listened? Or would he have dismissed it the way he dismissed so many of her concerns? The thought tightened something in my chest. I didn't suddenly believe my father was a villain. That would have been too simple, too convenient. What I was beginning to understand was more complicated and more painful, that safety and unpredictability can exist in the same person. That love does not cancel out control. That fear does not require cruelty to exist. My father loved us. I was sure of that, but love does not always make space for truth. As these realizations settled, the family narrative I had grown up with began to fracture. Not shatter, fracture. Small cracks, barely visible, but enough to change the way the light passed through. I saw my mother now not just as gentle, but as careful. Not just loving, but protective in ways I hadn't understood. Her final request began to make a terrible kind of sense. Perhaps she hadn't been afraid of telling him, because he would hurt her. Perhaps she had been afraid because he would not hear her. That kind of fear is harder to name, and harder to forgive. Sitting across from my father one night, listening to him talk about the future, about plans and arrangements, I felt the weight of the secret press down on me again. He spoke with certainty, with assumptions intact, unaware that the ground beneath those assumptions might not be as solid as he believed. I realized then that the father I thought I knew still existed. But he was not the whole truth. And if my mother had lived with that complexity for decades, carrying something she could never fully share, then perhaps her unrest had begun long before her final breath. The question that haunted me now was no longer what the secret was. It was why she believed it could never be safely spoken, and whether keeping it had been an act of love or of survival. The signs didn't arrive all at once. They surfaced slowly, quietly, the way truth often does when it knows you're not ready. At first, I told myself I was imagining patterns because grief makes everything feel meaningful. But grief doesn't rearrange objects. It doesn't hide things deliberately. My mother had done that. I noticed it the first time I cleaned out her closet. Her clothes were neatly arranged, familiar in color and shape, but one drawer resisted. It stuck halfway, as if something inside refused to move. When I finally pulled it open, I found an envelope tucked beneath folded scarves. My name was written on the front in her careful handwriting. My heart stumbled. I stood there longer than I meant to, holding it without opening it, already aware that this was not an accident. My mother had never labeled things unnecessarily. This had been placed, not forgotten. Inside was not a confession or explanation. It was a short note, almost mundane. "Keep this safe," it said. "You'll know when." That was all. I felt both comforted and unsettled. Guidance wrapped in ambiguity, memory masquerading as message. I slid the note back into the envelope and returned it to the drawer, suddenly unsure whether uncovering more was something I wanted or something she expected. After that, I began to notice other things. Small changes in routine that no longer felt random. The way she had reorganized the kitchen months before she died, moving certain papers into a single cabinet. The way she had insisted I take specific items home with me. Things I'd once thought sentimental, but now seemed oddly practical. One afternoon, sorting through a stack of old mail, I found a folder tucked behind tax documents. It contained copies of letters never sent. They were addressed to no one in particular, each beginning the same way, "If you ever need to understand." None of them were finished. The dates on the letters spanned years. Some were written in the early days of my parents' marriage. Others were recent, the ink still dark. Each one stopped just short of saying anything concrete, as if my mother had reached a line she could not cross. Reading them felt intrusive, like listening at a door she had chosen to keep closed. And yet she had kept them, preserved them, left them where they could be found. That contradiction followed me everywhere. I started paying attention to the house itself, the way certain rooms felt heavier than others. Her bedside table held a book she'd already read, marked with notes in the margins. One line was underlined twice. Silence protects until it doesn't. I closed the book with shaking hands. At night, I dreamed of her again, but the dreams changed. She no longer stood silently in doorways. Now she moved, pointing, opening drawers, leading me from room to room. I woke with the unsettling sense that she was not asking for peace. She was asking for action. The most disturbing discovery came unexpectedly. I was sorting through old photo albums when I found one I didn't recognize. It wasn't hidden exactly. It was placed behind the others, visible only if you moved them. Inside were photographs from a period of my parents' life they rarely talked about. The smiles looked practiced. The spacing between them felt deliberate. Tucked into the back cover was another envelope. This one wasn't labeled. Inside was a key. I stared at it for a long time, trying to place it. It didn't match any door in the house. It wasn't decorative or ceremonial. It was functional, ordinary, and completely unfamiliar. My pulse quickened. This was no longer about memory. This was about access. I thought about my mother's final days, about how restless she had seemed despite her exhaustion, how she'd watched me closely, as if gauging whether I would understand. Her request suddenly felt less like an attempt to bury the truth and more like a delay, a way to pass responsibility without forcing it. She hadn't said never. She had said not yet. That realization shifted something fundamental in me. The signs she'd left behind didn't feel accusatory. They felt intentional. She wasn't haunting me with regret. She was guiding me toward something she hadn't been able to face herself. And yet there was warning woven into every clue. The unfinished letters, the careful placement, the way everything pointed without explaining. She was urging the truth forward while still trying to protect us from its impact. I began to feel her absence differently, not as emptiness, but as presence stretched thin. Like a voice just beyond hearing, repeating the same question. How long can silence last before it becomes a lie? The secret no longer felt dormant. It felt active. It shaped my days, pulled my attention toward corners I had once ignored. I found myself watching my father more closely, listening not just to what he said, but to what he avoided. Every sign my mother left behind sharpened the tension between what I remembered and what I was beginning to understand. Memory softened things. Message hardened them. One evening, I returned the photo album to its place and stood there, hand resting on the shelf, feeling the weight of choice settle in my chest. These signs were not meant to be ignored. They were not artifacts of a restless mind. They were invitations and warnings. My mother hadn't trusted time to reveal the truth on its own. She had arranged its discovery carefully, thoughtfully, knowing exactly who would find it. Me. As I turned off the light and left the room, I understood something that made my breath catch. Her unrest wasn't about guilt. It was about timing. And the signs she left behind were not asking me to remember her. They were asking me to continue what she could not finish. Secrets don't reveal themselves all at once. They gather shape slowly, like fog lifting just enough for you to see the outline of something you wish would stay hidden. By the time I understood what my mother had been protecting, it was no longer possible to pretend I didn't see it. The fragments began to align without my permission. The letters unfinished and careful, the dates that stretched further back than I expected, the photographs where smiles looked rehearsed instead of natural, the key resting heavy in my palm, demanding context. Each piece alone meant nothing definitive. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I started retracing my mother's past, not the version told at holidays or condensed into anecdotes, but the quiet years she rarely spoke about. The years before I was born, the early years of her marriage, the spaces in between the stories. I remembered how she used to deflect questions about her life before my father. It wasn't important, she'd say, smiling gently. Everything important came after. At the time, I believed her. Now I recognized the skill in that answer. It ended curiosity without denying truth. Late one night, unable to sleep, I unlocked a small metal box I found hidden behind old linens. The key fit perfectly. Inside were documents, copies of records, old correspondence, a name I didn't recognize written repeatedly in my mother's handwriting. Not a lover's name, not a secret child, not anything dramatic in the way stories like to be. It was a legal name, a former name. My breath caught as I read, my mind racing to reconcile what I was seeing. My mother had lived part of her life under a different identity, not briefly, not accidentally, intentionally. The implications rippled outward immediately. This wasn't a secret born of shame alone. This was survival, reinvention, escape. I thought about my father's devotion to structure, to consistency, to truth as he defined it. I thought about how deeply he valued honesty, and how rigidly he reacted when his version of reality was challenged. If he had known that the woman he married was not entirely who she claimed to be, what would that have meant? Would he have forgiven her? Or would he have erased her? I sat on the floor surrounded by evidence of a life my mother had deliberately left behind, and the dread settled fully for the first time. This wasn't just her secret. It was a truth that destabilized everything my family believed about itself. I began to understand the cost of silence. Keeping this secret didn't just protect my father from pain. It protected my mother from judgment. And now, it protected me from having to choose sides. Silence preserved the illusion that nothing fundamental had been withheld. But illusions demand maintenance. The more I learned, the clearer it became that my mother had not been running from something, but toward safety. The past she buried held consequences she could not risk resurfacing. Legal, emotional, personal. She had rebuilt her life carefully, brick by brick, trusting that if she never disturbed the foundation, it would hold. Until it didn't. Her illness changed everything. Mortality has a way of loosening the grip on fear. She had known the truth would outlive her, and she had chosen me as its custodian. The question that haunted me now was not what the secret was, but why she believed it could never be shared. Was she protecting my father from a truth that would shatter his sense of control? Was she protecting herself from being reduced to a version of her past she had outgrown? Or was she protecting me from becoming collateral damage in a reckoning she knew would be brutal? Every answer felt incomplete. I noticed how my father spoke about my mother now, idealizing her, simplifying her, fitting her neatly into the story he needed to survive his grief. He talked about honesty, about how they had no secrets. Each time, my chest tightened. Silence was no longer neutral. It was active deception. And deception, even when born of love, has consequences. I imagined telling him, the shock, the disbelief, the anger that would follow once certainty cracked. I imagined him questioning every memory, every decision, every shared year. I imagined him looking at me, not as his child, but as someone who had known and stayed silent. The thought made me nauseous. But keeping the secret carried its own cost. I felt it in the way I spoke carefully now, in the way I edited my reactions, in the way my mother's presence lingered not as comfort but as tension. Her unrest was becoming mine. Protection had curdled into deception. Intention had collided with consequence. I understood then why she couldn't rest. The truth wasn't dangerous because it was ugly. It was dangerous because it demanded reckoning, because it required people to see each other without the safety of curated narratives, because it threatened identities built on certainty. My mother had lived with that tension for decades. She had carried the weight of being known only partially, loved for a version of herself that was true, but not complete. Now that weight sat squarely on my shoulders. I closed the box, my hands shaking, and pressed my palms against the lid as if I could contain what I had learned. The secret had taken shape. It had edges now, consequences. There was no returning to ignorance. As I turned off the light, one thought followed me into the darkness, steady and unavoidable. Keeping silent would no longer protect anyone. It would only decide who paid the price first. I used to think silence was passive, something you chose once and then simply maintained. I was wrong. Silence is alive. It works on you slowly, persistently, reshaping things you didn't intend to give up. By the time I understood what my mother had hidden, the cost of keeping it was already being paid. It showed up first in my body. Sleep became shallow and unreliable, as if my mind refused to rest while it stood guard. I woke in the early hours with my heart racing, certain I'd forgotten something important, certain I was about to be discovered, not by anyone else but by myself. Guilt does that. It sharpens your awareness until everything feels like a threat. During the day, I moved through familiar routines with an unfamiliar sense of detachment. Conversations felt rehearsed. Laughter arrived late, if at all. I noticed how often I paused before speaking, measuring words that once came naturally. Silence demanded vigilance, and vigilance eroded ease. My father noticed, of course. He asked if I was tired, if I was eating enough, if grief was finally catching up to me. I told him I was fine. The lie came smoothly, practiced already. Each time I used it, something inside me recoiled. I had promised my mother loyalty. I hadn't realized how quickly that loyalty would turn inward and begin to consume me. Our relationship shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. My father leaned on me the way he always had, but now every moment of closeness carried tension. I felt like an imposter in my own family, present but withholding, loved for a version of myself that wasn't fully real anymore. I began to resent the secret, then immediately felt ashamed for that resentment. It wasn't mine, I told myself. It had been entrusted to me. That framing made endurance feel virtuous, but endurance without honesty began to feel like self-betrayal. I saw my mother everywhere, in the kitchen light at dusk, in the habits I'd inherited without noticing. But instead of comfort, her presence stirred unease. I started to understand what it meant to say she couldn't rest. Rest isn't just physical, it's the absence of unfinished business. And she had left that business with me. Silence crept into my sense of identity. I had always believed I was an honest person. Not brutally honest, perhaps, but principled. Someone who valued truth even when it was uncomfortable. Now I was building my days around omission, adjusting myself to accommodate a lie that grew larger the longer I lived with it. I questioned myself constantly. Was I protecting my father, or was I protecting my own sense of belonging? Was I honoring my mother, or was I avoiding the consequences of telling the truth? Each question revealed a fracture in the narrative I had used to justify my silence. Peacekeeping, I realized, is often just damage control disguised as kindness. The secret began to affect my relationships beyond my family. Friends noticed my distraction, my emotional distance. I canceled plans more often, citing exhaustion I didn't know how to explain. How do you tell someone you're tired of holding something that isn't yours to hold? I felt split between versions of myself, the one who knew the truth and the one everyone else believed in. Maintaining that divide took energy I didn't have. Silence wasn't preserving peace. It was eroding me. Some nights I found myself standing in my mother's old bedroom, unsure why I'd gone there. I felt drawn to the spaces she had occupied, as if proximity might offer guidance. Instead, I felt her absence more acutely. She had lived with this secret for decades. She had learned to compartmentalize, to carry on. I was only weeks in and already unraveling. That comparison scared me. I wondered how many choices she had made to preserve the illusion of peace. How many times she had swallowed words to keep the family intact. How often she had chosen silence over self-expression because it felt safer. In trying to honor her final wish, I was reenacting the very pattern that had trapped her. The realization hit me one night as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spiraling. Honoring a dying wish felt noble. But what if that wish had been born of fear? What if keeping it alive meant extending harm rather than preventing it? I thought about betrayal. I had always believed betrayal required action, revealing secrets, breaking trust. I had never considered that silence itself could be a betrayal of self, of truth, of the possibility of genuine connection. My mother had asked me to keep this secret because she could no longer carry it. I had agreed because love makes promises easy in moments of crisis. But love, I was learning, also requires accountability. It requires the courage to ask whether a promise still serves the people it was meant to protect. Silence had already cost me sleep, peace, authenticity. It had begun to cost me my sense of integrity. The longer I kept it, the more complicit I felt, not just in hiding the truth, but in perpetuating a version of reality that demanded my constant self-erasure. I understood now why the signs my mother left behind felt urgent rather than comforting. She hadn't wanted the truth buried with her. She had wanted it held until someone was strong enough to face it. And silence was making me weaker, not stronger. As dawn crept in through the curtains one morning, I sat up, exhausted and clear in a way I hadn't been before. Keeping this secret had already changed me. It had already done damage. The question was no longer whether telling the truth would hurt. The question was how much more harm silence would cause if I let it continue. Loyalty had led me here. Self-betrayal kept me stuck. And somewhere between the two, I realized that peace built on silence is not peace at all. It is simply quiet damage, waiting to be acknowledged. There is a moment before every irreversible decision when time seems to hesitate. Not stop, just thin out enough for you to feel the weight of what's coming. I lived inside that moment for days, stretched so tight it felt like weeks, carrying two impossible options in each hand, and knowing one of them would eventually tear me apart. I tried to convince myself that choosing silence was still choosing love, that keeping my mother's promise was an act of devotion, not avoidance. But the argument no longer held. Silence had stopped feeling like loyalty and started feeling like surrender. Every memory of my mother crowded in, demanding attention. Her careful smile, the way she softened her voice when my father grew rigid, the pauses she took before answering simple questions. I saw now how often she had chosen peace over truth, harmony over honesty. I had inherited that instinct without realizing it. Was this what she wanted for me? I imagined her at the end, gripping my hand, fear in her eyes, not fear of death, but of consequences. She had been asking for protection. But protection from what? My father's pain, his anger, or the collapse of the life she had constructed so carefully? The answer shifted depending on the day, and with each shift, my certainty weakened. I also imagined my father as he was now, grieving, trusting, leaning on me with an openness I had never fully known. He spoke to me as if I were the last stable thing left. The thought of shattering that trust made my chest tighten until it hurt to breathe. I pictured telling him, the disbelief first, the denial, the questions that would follow, why she never told him, why I hadn't told him sooner, what else he didn't know. I imagined the anger turning inward, then outward, searching for somewhere to land. And I imagined myself standing in front of him, no longer just his child, but the bearer of a truth he had never consented to carry. Fear wrapped itself around every version of that future. But there was another future, too, the one where I said nothing, where I continued nodding, listening, pretending, where my father lived inside a story that felt safe but was fundamentally incomplete, where I learned to manage the secret better, to quiet my conscience, to become more like my mother had been. That future scared me in a different way. In that future, I saw myself growing smaller, more careful, less honest. I saw relationships shaped by omission, intimacy constrained by what could not be said. I saw myself explaining away the tightness in my chest, the restlessness, the guilt. In that future, I survived, but I didn't live. The realization settled heavily. Inaction was not neutral. Choosing silence was choosing a particular ending, one where the truth stayed buried and I slowly disappeared around it. I thought about responsibility, not legal, not moral in some abstract sense, but personal. Responsibility for who I was becoming. Responsibility for the story I would one day tell myself about this moment. My mother had lived with her choice for decades. I had lived with mine for months, and it was already breaking me. One night, unable to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table where my father and I had shared quiet breakfasts since her death. I rested my hands on the wood, grounding myself in something solid, and asked the question I had been avoiding. What kind of love demands self-destruction? The answer came quietly, but clearly. Fear does. I wasn't angry at my mother for asking what she did. I understood her too well now. She had been protecting the fragile balance of her life. She had been surviving in the only way she knew how. But survival strategies don't automatically become moral instructions. Loving someone doesn't mean inheriting their fear. I realized then that the promise I made had been born in a moment of crisis, shaped by grief and urgency. It had not accounted for time or consequence or the cost of carrying it forward. Promises made at the edge of death are powerful, but they are not always complete. Breaking the promise felt like betrayal. Keeping it felt like erasure. The pressure peaked the morning I caught myself rehearsing lies I hadn't been asked to tell yet. That was the moment I knew I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Silence was no longer a response to circumstance. It was a strategy. And strategies shape who you become. I stood in my bedroom, staring at my reflection, barely recognizing the person looking back. I looked older than I felt, tired in a way sleep could not fix, carrying a weight that was never meant to be mine alone. I understood then that moral courage isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with certainty or confidence. It arrives with trembling hands and a willingness to accept fallout. Telling the truth would not guarantee healing. It would not make everything right. It would, however, make everything honest. And honesty, I was learning, was the only foundation strong enough to stand on. I sat with the fear until it stopped screaming and started whispering, until it admitted what it was really afraid of, not my father's pain, but my own responsibility. Not the truth itself, but what it would demand of me afterward. Once spoken, the truth could not be reclaimed. But neither could my silence. As the day stretched on, the decision settled into place with an unexpected calm. Not relief, not peace, just clarity. I would tell him. Not because it was easy, not because it was kind in the short term, but because continuing to live inside a lie, however lovingly constructed, was costing me more than I could afford to lose. I whispered an apology to my mother, unsure whether it was necessary or meaningful. Then I stood up, heart pounding, aware that whatever came next would divide my life into before and after. Breaking the promise would hurt, but breaking myself would be permanent. And that was a cost I was no longer willing to pay. I chose a time when the house was quiet, not peaceful, just still. Evening light stretched across the living room, catching dust in the air, turning it visible. My father sat in his chair by the window, reading something he wasn't really absorbing. He looked smaller than I remembered, folded inward by grief in ways I still wasn't used to seeing. I stood there longer than I should have, watching him, letting fear make excuses for delay. This was the man who had built my world. The man whose sense of order had once made everything feel solid. In a few minutes, that order would be gone. "Dad," I said. He looked up immediately, attentive, open. "Yeah." That single syllable almost stopped me. There was no suspicion in it, no defense, just trust. I sat across from him, hands clasped so tightly my fingers ached. The words I had rehearsed dissolved the moment I opened my mouth. I realized then that there was no careful way to do this. Truth does not arrive gently when it has been delayed too long. "There's something Mom asked me to do," I began. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. "Something she told me at the end." His expression softened. "She talked to you." I nodded. "She asked me to keep a secret from you." The air shifted immediately. His shoulders stiffened just slightly, but enough that I noticed. "A secret," he repeated. "From me." "Yes." He didn't interrupt. That was worse. He waited, eyes steady, giving me space I no longer wanted. I told him then, slowly, imperfectly, about the promise, about the things I found afterward, the letters that stopped mid-sentence, the key, the documents, the name that wasn't hers when she was younger. I told him about the life she had left behind and the reasons I believed she had never shared it. As the truth took shape between us, I watched it fracture him in real time. At first, there was disbelief, a quiet shake of the head, a faint, incredulous laugh. "That doesn't make sense," he said. "She would have told me." I kept going. Denial followed, firmer this time. He interrupted, corrected details, reframed memories. "You're misunderstanding," he said. "There has to be an explanation." "There is," I said gently. "This is it." When denial failed, silence arrived. Heavy, pressurized. He stared at the floor, jaw clenched, breathing shallow. I could almost hear his internal structure collapsing, beams snapping one by one. "This means," he started, then stopped. He swallowed hard. "This means I didn't really know her." The sentence hung between us, devastating in its simplicity. I felt my own chest crack open then, not with relief, but with grief sharpened by responsibility. This was the destruction I had imagined. Not shouting, not rage, just the slow dismantling of certainty. He stood abruptly and began packing. "Why wouldn't she tell me?" he demanded, voice rising. "After everything, after all these years." I hesitated, then answered honestly. "I think she was afraid." "Of what?" he snapped. I met his eyes. Of not being believed, of losing the life she built, of what would happen if the truth didn't fit into how you see the world. The words landed hard. I hadn't meant them as accusation, but truth rarely cares about intent. He stopped packing. For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly, "So you're saying this is my fault?" "No," I said quickly. "I'm saying it's complicated." He laughed bitterly. "That's what people say when they don't want to place blame." Honesty versus denial. We stood on opposite sides of it now, both bleeding in different ways. I told him about the toll the secret had taken on me, the sleepless nights, the guilt, the way silence had started to hollow me out. I told him I wasn't telling him to hurt him, but because carrying it any longer was destroying me, and because I believed he deserved the truth, even if it hurt. His anger flared then, sharp and sudden. "You knew," he said. "You knew and you let me grieve a lie." The words struck deep. I felt them lodge in my chest, painful and justified. "Yes," I said, "and I'm sorry." The room vibrated with emotion that had nowhere to go. He sank back into his chair, pressing his palms to his face. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet and unfocused. "I thought we had no secrets," he whispered. "I think she wanted that to be true," I said, "even if it was." That was when something unexpected happened. His shoulders sagged, not in defeat but in release. The anger drained, leaving behind exhaustion. "She was always afraid of disappointing me," he said slowly, as if speaking to himself. "I thought I was protecting us by being clear, by being firm." I didn't interrupt. "I didn't realize how much space she needed," he continued, "or how little I gave her." The truth had fractured him, but it had also opened something. We sat there for a long time, not talking. The tension that had haunted me since my mother's death loosened its grip. It didn't vanish, but it shifted. It became shared. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter. "I wish she'd trusted me enough to tell me." "So do I said, "but I understand why she didn't." He nodded slowly. "And you," he asked, "do you understand why you did?" I took a breath. "Yes." We didn't resolve anything that night. There was no clean ending, no forgiveness neatly exchanged, but something essential had changed. The truth was no longer trapped inside me. It existed between us now, painful and real. As I stood to leave the room, my father spoke again. "Thank you," he said, surprising me, "for telling me, even though it hurts." I nodded, throat tight, understanding finally what my mother had known all along. Truth doesn't arrive gently. But when it finally arrives, it gives you back the ability to breathe. The days after I told my father did not unfold the way I imagined. There was no single explosion, no final argument that burned everything down. Instead, there was a quiet reordering, subtle and relentless, like furniture being moved in the dark. Nothing looked the same, even when it stood in the same place. My father withdrew at first, not from me entirely, but from the version of life he had been living. He moved through the house slowly, deliberately, as if every step required reassessment. He spoke less, thought more. Grief took on a new shape, no longer just the absence of my mother, but the absence of certainty. I felt responsible for that, even when I told myself it had been inevitable. Some days he asked questions about dates, about details, about moments he replayed endlessly trying to locate the truth he had missed. Other days he said nothing at all. Silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer concealment, it was processing. Our relationship shifted into unfamiliar territory. We were no longer bonded solely by shared loss. We were bound by shared truth, and that truth was heavy. Conversations became more careful, but also more real. We disagreed openly for the first time in years. It was uncomfortable and strangely relieving. Not everyone adjusted. Extended family reacted unevenly. Some didn't want to know. Some resented that the story they had relied on was no longer intact. A few blamed me quietly, politely, as if truth were something I had invented rather than uncovered. Bonds I thought were unbreakable loosened, revealing how much they depended on illusion. I grieved those losses more than I expected. At the same time, unexpected connections deepened. A relative who had always been distant reached out, sharing stories that finally made sense. A friend who had watched me struggle without understanding suddenly saw me clearly. These connections were quieter, less dramatic, but sturdier. Clarity, I learned, doesn't arrive without cost. My own sense of identity shifted in ways I was still discovering. For so long, I had defined myself by loyalty, by endurance, by the ability to hold things together. Now I was learning how to exist without constant vigilance. The absence of the secret left a hollow space at first. Then, slowly, it filled with something else, self-trust. I slept better, not perfectly but honestly. Dreams no longer chased me awake. When guilt surfaced, it didn't spiral. It rested, acknowledged, then passed. I was adapting, not healing, and that distinction mattered. I thought often about my mother. Her unrest made sense now, not as guilt alone, but as incompletion. She had lived between versions of herself, loved for one, haunted by another. The truth I had carried had been her unfinished bridge. Crossing it did not erase her pain, but it honored it. My father began speaking about her differently, less idealized, more human. He admitted things he had never said before, regrets, blind spots, fears. I listened without defending or correcting. Understanding had replaced certainty. Some nights we sat in the living room without speaking, both aware of what had changed. The silence felt fragile but honest, not peaceful yet, but real. Survival, I realized, isn't about returning to who you were. It's about learning how to live as who you are now. There were moments I missed the illusion, moments when clarity felt sharp and unforgiving. But even then, I knew I wouldn't trade it back. The truth had cost me comfort, but it had given me coherence. My life made sense again, even if it hurt. I stopped wondering whether I had done the right thing. That question belonged to the past. What mattered now was what I did with the understanding I had earned. The aftermath was not an ending. It was an adjustment, a recalibration of relationships, expectations, and selfhood. Some things were lost permanently. Others emerged stronger for having been tested. And in that slow, imperfect adaptation, I understood something essential. Truth doesn't fix everything, but it gives you a chance to live without pretending that everything is already fixed. It took time for the question to settle into something I could hold without flinching. For weeks after everything was said, after the truth had reshaped our lives, I kept returning to the same thought. My mother hadn't been afraid of death. She had been afraid of leaving something unfinished behind. At the end, when she asked me to keep her secret, I thought she was asking for silence. I understand now that she was asking for time. She had lived most of her life carrying two truths at once, the woman she had been and the woman she became. Both were real. Both mattered. But only one was allowed to exist out loud. Loving her meant loving the version she could safely share, and she had learned to survive inside that narrowing space. That kind of survival leaves marks. My mother's unrest wasn't born from guilt in the way people like to imagine it. She wasn't tormented by wrongdoing. She was burdened by incompleteness, by the knowledge that parts of her story remained unspoken, not because they were shameful, but because they were dangerous to the fragile peace she had built. Peace, she knew, can be conditional. For years, silence had protected her. It had allowed her to build a family, to be loved, to belong. But silence also kept her divided. Every truth withheld requires energy. Every omission demands attention. And over time, that vigilance becomes its own kind of imprisonment. When illness stripped away her strength, what remained was clarity. She knew she could not carry the secret with her. She also knew she was not ready to unleash it herself. So she passed it to me, not to bury, but to hold until it could be faced. I was never meant to keep it forever. Understanding that changed how I remembered her final moments. Her fear wasn't about punishment or exposure. It was about timing, about whether the truth would arrive in a way that destroyed everything or allowed something new to form. She couldn't rest because the truth was still waiting. Now, looking back, I see how much courage it took for her to live as she did. Not the loud kind of courage that demands recognition, but the quiet endurance of someone navigating a world that had limited room for complexity. She loved deeply. She adapted constantly. She paid the price of silence so others wouldn't have to. But love built on silence always asks someone to disappear. When I finally spoke the truth, I didn't free her from guilt. I freed her from suspension. Her story could move forward even after her death. It could breathe. It could be held honestly. And in telling it, I inherited something else: responsibility. Secrets don't vanish when they're revealed. They transform. They become legacy. They shape how we understand ourselves and the people who came before us. What we do with that inheritance matters. For a long time, I believed strength meant holding things together at any cost. My mother believed that too. It's how she survived. But survival is not the same as peace. Peace requires integration. Strength, I've learned, is not silence. It is not sacrifice without consent. It is the willingness to tell the truth even when it unsettles the story you wish were simpler. Love, too, is not protection at all costs. Sometimes love is the courage to risk being known. My mother couldn't rest because the truth demanded acknowledgement, not punishment, not absolution, just recognition. She needed someone to see her whole, even if only after she was gone. Now she is. The house feels different these days. Lighter somehow, not happier, not fixed, but quieter in a way that doesn't press down on my chest. When I think of her, I no longer feel the pull of unfinished business. I feel sadness, gratitude, and something close to peace. Silence kept her safe. Truth let her go. If there is anything I carry forward from this, it is this understanding. Secrets shape us whether we speak them or not, but only truth allows us to stop carrying them alone. That is why she couldn't rest. And that is why, finally, she can.